Today's daf is daf Pei Beis. Let's begin with a review, an overview of the Mishnah on daf Pei Aleph Amid Beis. And the discussion is about a korban Pesach that became Tameh. And in the case of a korban Pesach that became Tameh or became Notzar, so the Mishnah on the bottom of Pei Aleph Amid Beis says that if you have most of the lamb, and certainly if you have all the lamb intact, then we have to burn it because it became possible b'toras tameh or b'toras nosar in the environment of the Beis Hamikdash, which means right outside the Azor, the Beis Hadeshin. And in such a case, we're allowed to use the atzei maracha for the sreifa, as fuel for the sreifa. So the rule is that whenever you're burning within the environment of the Beis Hamikdash, you can use atzei maracha. And later on, we'll talk about that as to why you're allowed to use atzei maracha. But the Mishnah establishes that if nitma miuto, meaning as you severed the parts of the korban Pesach, only one segment contracted tuma, then in such a case, the Mishnah says, we're not going to give you that leniency of allowing you to burn the kodshim inside the environments of the Beis Hamikdash and allow you to use atzei maracha. We're going to send you home wherever you are in Yerushalayim, and that's where you're going to burn it. And then we began the Gemara here on the bottom of Daf Mem Aleph Amid Beis. The Gemara starts by explaining the reasoning, my timer. Why is it that the Sreif has to take place in the environs of the Beis Hamikdash and not anywhere in Yerushalayim? After all, we're talking about the bus of Kodshim Kalim. Of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina Kidei Levaisham, that since the Bailim were not careful in guaranteeing that the korban Pesach would not contract tumah, they allowed, for whatever reason, and in any circumstance, for the basa to contract tumah, and therefore it has to be burned. So they required burning it in a public area, which is in the environment of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's so that he gets the message that next time he should be more careful, and it embarrasses him. But the main thrust of our discussion begins here with the words nitma miuto. So if you take a look, you're on Daf Pei Aleph Amid Beis, 3 lines up from the bottom. The Mishnah differentiates between in the Reisha where Rubo was Nitma and the Sefer where Miuto was Nitma. In the case of Miuto and Nitma, then the Tameh or the Nosar has to be burned somewhere in Yerushalayim. We're not going to allow him the leniency of availing himself of the Atzei Marach. He has to use his own Eitz Murabinu. But what about the Mishnah that we studied back on Daf Mem Tes? And the Mishnah there said, "V'chenim micha yotzav Yerushalayim v'nizkar sheyesh b'yodo b'sar kodesh." A person left Yerushalayim, he's on his route, and he reminds himself that he's carrying on in his bag. He's got basar of kodesh, which is kodshim kalim, and the moment that kodshim kalim leave the environments of Yerushalayim, they're outside the bounds of Yerushalayim. That's called the psul of yotzei. And he has to go back to Yerushalayim to burn these kodshim shenifsalu. Im avar tzofim, however, even though technically he's required to burn these kodshim shenifsalu in Yerushalayim, but if he's on his road, his derech, his travels, and avar tzofim, he passed a certain area which is outside Yerushalayim, it's a big tircha for him to go back to Yerushalayim, then Sarfa B'Mkomo, we're going to waive the requirement of going back to Yerushalayim to burn the Kodshim Shenifzu in Yerushalayim. We're going to allow him to burn it at home, wherever he is. V'im lav, but if he's still within close proximity of Yerushalayim, the Mishnah back on Daf Memtes establishes that, and here we start off Beis Amid Aleph. Choser v'sarfo lifnei abira. He's going to have to go back to Yerushalayim, but again, there's a good part of it too. Me'atze maroch. He doesn't have to spend his own money and hassle running around trying to find fuel, find logs. He's allowed to use atze maroch. And this is against our Mishnah here on Daf Pei Aleph Amid Beis, because in our Mishnah, it would seem that if it was nitma miuto, then the halacha would be that he would burn it, as the Mishnah says, b'chatzotzeim or gagabeim, meaning anywhere in Yerushalayim. The Mishnah back on Daf Mem Tes makes no such distinction. In fact, the Mishnah says that even if nitma kizayis min abasar, that's enough. And a kizayis min abasar is certainly less than rov. And yet the Mishnah says that unless he's past Sofim, he's going to go back to the environment of the Beis Hamikdash and use the Atei Maracha to burn his Kodshim Shenifsalu. Our Mishnah says that if it's only Miyuto, then, as we said before, he burned to B'chatzer Oseyim anywhere in Yerushalayim. How do we reconcile the two Mishnayos? Amar Chama bar Ukva lo kasha, there's no stira. Kan in our Mishnah back on Daf Mem Tes, be'achsanoi. We're talking about a person who deserves a leniency, give him a break, because he's only a guest in Yerushalayim. He has no access to eitzim. When you're at home, you have access to wood and to logs. And since he doesn't have access to eitzim because he's an achsanoi, we're going to require that he go back to the Beis Hamikdash, again, if he's within the area up to Tzofim, but not as a chumrah because we want to be harsh with him, but rather as a kula because we want to allow him to use the Atze Maracha for the purpose of Sreifas Kodshim. So it's really a kula that we're allowing an achsanai to use the Atze Maracha for his mitzvah of Sreifa, but in order to allow that, we have to be machmir on him and force him to come back to Yerushalayim, because we cannot take the Atze Maracha and allow him to use that out of Yerushalayim. And this has to do with the heter of shimush, of ishtamshus bi'atze maracha, that, again, there's no Isser Me'ilah like there is in Hegdesh. And the reason for that is that Beis Din is going to make a t'nai, that whenever we want to allow a person to use the Atze Maracha, he'll be allowed to do so. And that was the t'nai they made when they were Magdish the Atze Maracha. And in the case of Achsanoi, they allowed the Atze Marach to be used by the Achsanoi, who's here in Yerushalayim on a temporary basis. He doesn't have access to Eitzim. But of course, he's got to do that in the area of the Beis HaMikdash. Khan, our Mishnah, on the other hand, is talking about a Balabais. He lives in Yerushalayim. That's why the Mishnah says that he'll burn the Kodshim Shenifsalu somewhere in his Chatzeros, his Gagos, anywhere in Yerushalayim. And the reason why we're not going to be makil for him and allow him to use Atze Maracha, again requiring him to be sorif in the Bira, is because he doesn't deserve such a leniency of using Atze Maracha. He's local. And if he's local, he has access to his own logs, and he'll spend his own pocket money out of pocket for the fuel. So that's Rav Chama. Now we have Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, Hava ha b'achsanoi. Now, let me just add one more point to Rav Chama. In the case of a local who lived in Yerushalayim, it's only in miut that will allow him to burn it on the Chatzeros. If it's Nitma Rubo, then we have the Svara the Gemara gave earlier, that since he wasn't careful about Tumah, we want to publicize the fact that he has to burn his Basar Pesach, and therefore we require him to come to the Biro, which is more of a public area. Rav Papa says both Mishnayos are talking about Achsanoi. Khan, In the Mishnah back on Daf Memtes, we're talking about someone who is hechzik bader. He's already on the road. Again, you can have an achsanoi who hasn't started its trek yet, and that's the subject of the Mishnah later on, but of our Mishnah. But I'm saying the earlier Mishnah is talking about an achsanoi who's already on his road, and they don't want to be matriach. The chachamim want to make a leniency for him that he doesn't have to go backwards or delay his trip once he's already begun his journey to have to run around looking for eitzim. So they said, you know what? We're going to allow you to use atzei maroch. But Khan, the Mishnah here on Daf Pei Aleph, is a case of an achsanoi shelo hitzik b'derech. So again, even though he's not at home, and even though it's going to be a bit of a tircha, hassle for him to gather up the eitzim for fuel, nevertheless, we're going to require him to do so. And he has to go running around looking for eitzim. We're not going to be lenient because he hasn't started on his trek. Rav Zvid Omar, Rav Zvid goes back to the original answer of Rav Chama. Li olam kid Omar me'akar, like we said before. Kan b'achsanoi v'kan b'balabayis. And I'm not going to accept Rav Papa that Chachamim were makil on behalf of a guest in Shtut, only in the case where he is out on the road, but rather we're going to be makil for every achsanoi, and we're going to allow use of the atzei maroch, even though he hasn't started his trek. And the reason for that is because achsanoi came under Leslie, since he doesn't have access to logs of wood, he's a guest here in town. Asa'o, they gave him the status of tzaikonim. Tzaikonim are the stingy people that are not going to spend too much money on eitzim. Here also we're afraid that the achsanoi, since he doesn't have access to eitzim, he's not going to make that extra effort and tircha in order to find eitzim, and therefore will allow him, like in the case of tzaikonim, to use atzei maroch and b'snan. Hatzaikonim sorfen also lefnei abiripnei bishvil lihenos me atzei maroch. In the case of tzaikonim, we're not willing to spend the money on the eitzim. Apparently, eitzim were significant. Therefore, we're going to allow him to use the atzei maroch, but then we have to require of him that he be sorifit lifnei habira, so that according to Rav Zvid, like Rav Chama before him, the Mishnah later on I mean here, our Mishnah on Pei Aleph on Beis, that's the later Mishnah, I should say. That Mishnah that we're studying now is talking about a case of a balabayis. And if he's a balabayis, then he has access to eitzim. And in the case of nitma miuto, we're not going to be makil. We're not going to require that the sreifa take place in the base habira together with using the atzim maroch. He has plenty of eitzim wherever he is, and will allow him to we're not going to require to be mavayashin because it was only miuto of the carbon that became tummy, and let him burn it in his backyard with his own eitzim. We don't have to be makil to bring him back to the bira in order to allow him to use atzei maroch. He has his own eitzim. He's not an achsanoi. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in a brisa, and we're talking now about a case of nitma ma'at mi basar pesach, a limited amount of the basar became tamei or became nosar. Oh, now these tzaikonim that are very stingy, and Chazal allowed them to use the atzei marocha lifnei abira, is l'sarfa b'chatzoseihem. Bo means they ratzu, they came and they decided, you know what, we're not going to take advantage of this leniency and come back to the bira and use the atzei marocha. You know what we want to do? We want to burn it b'chatzoseihem. And now we're going to take the atzei marocha because they're offering it to us, and we're going to go with the atzei marocha and burn it wherever we want. Ein chomelam. We're not going to be matir. The Gemara is going to say why we're not going to allow them to take the atzei marocha back home. And even if they decide they want to stay in the local bira, meaning right outside the Beis Hamikdash, and they're going to use their own eitzim for burning the kachim, we're not going to allow them. So the Gemara says the following: Bishlema, I can understand the first din that me'atzei maracha v'tzachsoseim ain't shomen lehem. We're not going to allow them to take the atzei maracha on their shoulders and go back to their homes and burn it at home. Why? Dilma paishan minayu v'asabuli de takala. You know what? These are atzei maracha, and they have a status of kodesh, except for those cases, as we said before, where the Rabbanon made a tnai in the original hegdish. But this is not that case. So therefore, they may come to de takala. They may mix up these eitzim with their own eitzim, and inadvertently they will use atzei marach, which has the status of a hegdish for their own purposes. That's me'ilah. Ella, but the second din, lifnei abira me'atzei atzman, my time alone. If they decide that they want to burn their kodshim shenifsalu in front of the Migdash with their own eitzim, what do we care about that? There's no Isa Me'il involved. Of Yosef Omar, here we have Machlot Shin of Yosef and Rava. Shalalavayish is Misha Einlo. These individuals are lucky enough to have the money to spend on eitzim. So they boast about it and they publicly use their eitzim to burn, the kodshim shenifsalu. But what about those who can't afford the eitzim? So we'd rather it be very private in nature, not public, because it's going to embarrass those who cannot. Very often the Chazal are sensitive; they make takanos in order not to embarrass someone who cannot do it. Like the Mishnah at the end of Tainus, that on Tu Av they borrowed. Even the rich girls had to borrow kalim from others. All right. Rava says there's a different reason why they're not going to allow them to burn the kodshim shenifsalu in front of the biur with their own eitzim. Mipnei chashad. This is going to create a chashad. People are going to suspect that they are stealing atzei maracha, and they're benefiting from. Why? Because if they're using their own eitzim in this public place outside the Migdash, people think that it's not their own eitzim. Now, when they have leftover eitzim, after they finish the process of making that fire to burn the kodshim shenifsalu, they're going to take the surplus eitzim back home and use them for their purposes, which technically they're allowed to do, but it's going to create chashad. People are suspecting that those eitzim on the way back from the bira home are atzei maracha, and they're using the atzei maracha for their own purposes, violating the Yisur Me'ilah. My beinayu. So Gemara offers two nafkaminas between Rav Yosef and Rava. Ika beinayu, the first nafkamina is the Isi Kani Vichariyusa, the Lochazi Lamarocha. What happens if the logs that they're using are logs that cannot, they're absolutely disqualified for Atzei Marocha. Everybody knows they're not Atzei Marocha. In the case of eitzim that are from a dekel tree, from a palm tree, but they're very dry, and if they're very dry, we don't allow using them for Atzei Marocha. So if we go with Rava, then we're going to allow him to use these eitzim that are clearly, recognizably not Atzei Marocha, and to burn his own kodshim shenifsalu publicly, because no one will suspect him when he goes back home that he took atzei maracha from that area, because the eitzim clearly are not usable and not suitable for atzei maracha. But according to the shita of Rav Yosef, this would also be asur, because if they use these eitzim, it's going to embarrass those people who don't have eitzim. I thought there was a second afkamina, but that's coming up later on. Tanan Hasam. Here we have another machlokas between Rabba and between Rava and Rav Yosef. Here's there's going to be two nafkaminas, and we're learning a Mishnah in Masechet Tamid, Every morning after the Ketores was brought and there was Hatomas Haneros, in the Rosh Hamamad, there were Mamados, those were representatives of the people of Israel who had to come for a Korban Tzibur to be in the Azara when they were makriv the Korban. So the Rosh Hamamad, every one of these groups of Mamados had its leader who was supervising. By a Mamadis Hatmeim al Shara Mizrach. Now, you know that the Kohanim are divided up into 24 Mishmaros. Each one of those Mishmaros gets a week of Avodah times 2 in 6 months, and then another 6 months, all told 2 weeks out of the entire year. And then they took each Mishmeres and they divided up into 6 Batei Av. And leaving out Shabbos for a minute, but during the 6 days of the week, there was a base Av that was in charge of the Avodah for that day. So imagine if you're part of a Mishmeres, you will get 1 day to serve as a Kohen in the Beis HaMikdash. And if the Kohen contracted Tumah, do you remember that when we were children, I don't know, I don't remember this, but at least on the cartoons, they used to show us that if a child misbehaved in kindergarten, they would put him in the corner with a dunce hat on. So that's exactly what happens over here, that the Rosh Hamamad would take Kohanim Tmeim, and you're on duty, man. This is your day. You're a part of the Beis Av. This is your 1 day in 6 months when you get a chance to do the Avodah, and you weren't careful enough, and you contracted Tumah. I'm going to set you up on the Shara Mizrach. That's where the entry is. You know, the entry to the Mikdash is on the eastern side, and that's a public area. And you're wearing a dunce cap. You know, everyone's going to see, why is this Kohen not inside the Mikdash doing the Avodah? Why is he out here in the Shara? He must be Tomei. And next time you be more careful. My time, Rav Yosef Kidei Levaisha. Rav Omar Mipnei Chashad. Rava says that there's going to be a chashad, that Bnei Adam, people are going to think that these Kohanim are not serving in the Beis HaMikdash. And the reason why they're not willing to serve in the Beis HaMikdash is not because they're Tmeim. They don't know, right? The people, the average person, spectator, he doesn't know this guy's Tamei. He thinks his Kohen would rather do his, he has a malacha, he has a geshev, he has to make a living, and he'd rather, dedicate himself to that than to show up and do the avodah. So they made a takana that we're going to put him standing in the shar of the Har Bayis, and everybody will know that he's tamei, and that's why he's not entering, and they will not suspect him of being, more connected to his malacha than to the avodah in the mikdash. My beinayu, and here the Gemara gives 2 nafkaminas. Ika beinayu, the first nafkamin is mefanke. What happens with idle people, Kohanim who don't have a geschäft, they don't have a business, is according to Rava, we don't have to set them up in the Shar Mizrach in order to avoid chashad, because what was the chashad? That people suspect they're not tmeim, but the reason why they're not doing the avodah is because they have a geschäft. Everybody knows this guy has no occupation whatsoever. Whereas according to Rav Yosef, it's irrelevant whether you have an occupation or you don't. We want to be mavayish you because you're a Kohen in this base Av and you contracted to him. Inami, another nafkamina, the kogadil shishura. We're talking about what's called klias chitim, lasos mem chavolim. This is like a menial kind of a job, and people know that if you go into this, this business, you make pittance. And therefore, no one's going to be choshed him that the reason why he doesn't want to do the Avodah Mikdash is because he's busy with his malacha. And in that sense, it's very similar to the previous case of Mefanke. And if there's a chashad, like Rava says, then we don't have to worry about chashad in this case, where if the tam is Kedei Levaishal, like Rav Yosef, then we will set him up in the Shara Mizrach because he was not careful about Tumah Vitara. The Mishnah says, Pesach Pesach was taken out of its machitza, which means out of the Chom of Yushalayim. Osha Nitmar contracted to me, Soref Miyad. On the 14th of Nisan, we burn it. However, Nitmu Abailin, Osha Mesu. Now the carbon is possible for a different reason, because a carbon Pesach has to be lit li ochlav and lebailov, and here we don't have ochlav, we don't have bailim. Either because the bailim can't eat the korban pesach that's made, or there are no bailim, they went to the next world, and therefore you can't have a korban pesach which has no bailim to it. So there's a psul in the korban pesach. However, it's not a psul begufo shel pesach. It's not like tuma. It's not inherent in the pesach. It's extraneous. It's the lack of bailim, and in that case, tiubar tzura. So we have to wait till it's nosar, and only then do we burn it. Because since the basar itself, the carbon itself, is really roy misadatzmo, it is fit for the mizbeach. We don't want to burn it. We have to wait till it becomes nosar. Then it's possible good. And then the Mishnah goes on to say v'sarif b'shishasar on the 16th of Nisan. Again, it became possible on the 14th of Nisan. We're not going to burn it the next day on the 15th because that day is Yontif. And we don't burn Kodshim on Yontif. So we wait till the 16th, which is Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Yochanan Broka disagrees with the Tanakama. And what does he say? Af zeh, even this case where the Bailim became Tomei or they died, Yisaref miyat. Lefisha ein lo ochlim. If there are no ochlim on a korban pesach, the korban pesach becomes possible, and it's a psul begufa. Irrelevant to the fact that it's not Tomei or Yotze, it's called a psul begufo, and therefore we burn it immediately. So the Gemara says, Bishleim Tomei. The Gemara wants to know what is the source for this requirement of burning kodesh and nitma, or kodesh yotze michutz. In the case of Tomei Ksiv, the Torah says Vayikra Zion. It says with regard to kodshim kalim v'abasar shayika b'chol tomei lo yochel ba'esh yisaref, requiring sreifa of kodshim kalim that contracted tumah, hashayiga b'chol tameh, el yotze minola. How do we know that there's a requirement of sreifa in the case of a carbon that became possible, not because it contracted tumah, but because it was taken out of its mechitza? And the Gemara answers the chsiv, and this is based on a parsha of the Soyer Rosh Chodesh and Aaron Ubanav. And the truth is, Rabbi, I need about 10 minutes here to give you a background for this, but unfortunately, we don't have that time. So I'm just going to rattle it off as fast as I can. After Nadav Avihu died on the 8th day of the Miluim, then Aaron Ubanav brought 3 Seirei Chatas. One was called the Soyer Rosh Chodesh, the other was called the Sar Nachshon ben Aminadav, the third was called the Seir Izim Lechatas, and it became clear to Moshe and Aaron that they would burn the soyer of Rosh Chodesh. They didn't eat the basar. And Moshe Rabbeinu, when he finds out that Aaron made this decision and that his remaining two sons, that's Elazar and Itamar, would burn the soyer l'Rosh Chodesh, he got very angry at them. And he says to them, Madua lo achaltem, as we'll see inside the Gemara. The pasuk says that when Aaron Ubanav burnt the soyer Rosh Chodesh on the 8th day of the Miluim, and Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, Hein lo huva es dama el hakodesh pnima. Moshe Rabbeinu got upset with them. Why did you burn the soyer of Rosh Chodesh, that chatos? Amalo Moshe li Aaron. What was he saying, Moshe? In lo huva es dama el hakodesh pnima. Madua lo achaltem es hachatos. Why didn't you eat the soyer Rosh Chodesh? Is it because Shema perhaps nichnas dama lifnai v'lifnim? Now, what we're talking about in the case of a chatos is a case of yotze. Yotze means chutz l'mechitza. Now, chutz l'mechitza can mean one of two things, and it means both. It could mean either that they took the dam of the chatos and they brought it into the heichal, that's outside its mechitzos, or they took the dam out of the azara, and that's also outside of the mechitzos. And Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to Aaron, Ubanav, did you have a situation where the chatos of Rosh Chodesh, the soyer, was taken out of its mechitza, that you burnt the baso and you didn't eat it? So Aaron turns to Moshe and says, Lav, no, you're right. I can't tell you that the dam of the chatos was taken inside the heichal. V'yamar and Moshe responds to Aaron. He says, "Shema b'chutz l'mechitzasi yotza." Maybe you took it outside the azara. That's another way of chutz l'mechitza, either pnima or chita, kuta. Amalo la b'kodesh hoisa. It was always inside the azara. Amalo. So Moshe says to Aaron, "Iba kodesh hoisa is vehein lo huva is dama el kodesh pnima. Madua lo achaltam. So why did you eat the basar of this chatos? Why did you burn it?" Michlal, what we see from this whole parsha is the nafka had the mitzias been that they had taken the karban chatos outside of its mechitza in this direction or that, which means nafka took him out of the azor, or inami ayel dama lifnim, they took it inside the hechal. Asreifai, then Moshe Rabbeinu would have no qualms, and he would have agreed that you have to burn it. So this is the source for the halach in our Mishnah that a carbon which is yatsa michut to michitzasa needs sreifa. So tuma is explicit in the pasuk, and yotze is derived from the parsha of the chatas of Aaron. The Gemara says, "Wait a minute, I have two questions to ask." Question number one: Bishlei benitma gol yirachmanu b'kodshim kalim is kolshke b'kodshim kodshim. The pasuk that we began with of Habasa Sheyiga B'chol Tameh, which is in Vayikra Perek Zayin, that's referring to Kodshim Kalim. And therefore I could derive a Kalvachomer that's certainly Kodshim Kodshim, which is more Chamor. If it becomes Tameh, you certainly have to burn it. And by the way, it's very interesting because what the Gemara is saying is that the higher level of Kedusha requires Sreifa. Like Sreifa is like a Chashivus. Eliyotze, but what about the case of Aaron? That chatos about which Moshe Rabbeinu would have admitted that you should burn it if it had been possible towards Yotze, is Ashkechan Kodshe Kodshim. Chatos is called Kodshe Kodshim. Kodshim Kalaminola. This could not be your source for the mitzvah of Sreifa of Kodshim Shenifsalu in the case of Yotze, because how do you know it in the case of Kodshim Kalam? And furthermore, we have a brisa that says that if a behema of a carbon is lon dama, that means they didn't do this rika of the mizbeach and it was already after shkia. We have a principle called dam nifsal b'shkia sachama, and here we turn to daf pei beis amid beis. Or nishpach dama. Another case is that the dam fell on the ritzpah. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't have to research this, it's before there was Kabbalah Saddam, or Yotza Dama Chutz L'Kloim, or the dam was taken outside the Azara, the Kaimal and B'Sreifa. In all these cases, we need Sreifa. How do we know this? You can't prove it from the pasuk that says Tameh, or the pasuk that says Yote. These are not neither Tameh nor Yotze. Right? We have Lon Dama, and we have Nishpach Dama, and we have Yotze Dama Chutz Yushalayim. None of these cases fit your billing of Nitma or Chutz. Probably he's not referring to Yotze Dama Chutz Yushalayim.